but there were others who felt threatened.
This time tomorrow, Joseph Smith will be long gone.
Perhaps fearful of a doctrine they did not understand. Perhaps distrustful of so many new arrivals.
There he is. Grab him. Hey, come on. Come on, children.
In this film, Joseph Smith, the Prophet of the Restoration, produced by the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith is then dragged out of his bed, tarred and feathered. As you heard in the narrator's description, she is leaving it for you to decide if this act of this mob is because Joseph Smith was teaching too much truth, too pure of doctrine for these people to understand and accept, or was this event fallout from an influx of new members moving into this area? I watched this movie all the time growing up, and of course they portrayed Joseph Smith in the most sympathetic light possible. They do not mention, however, in this tar and feathering incident that the mob was also attempting to castrate him, and some people think the reason they were trying to castrate him was because he had been messing around with the daughter of one of the people that were in this area. This is just a snapshot of what I found to be so common within my experience being a member of the Mormon Church, which is that they are showing real historic events. It is believed upon by all parties, ex-Mormons, non-Mormons, believing members, that Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered on that night. Everybody can agree on that. What's not agreed upon is if he deserved it, why it happened, and what were the motives involved in this action. We will be discussing this tar and feathering story amongst many others in today's video. Today's video is technically a part 2 of the series I'm doing about Joseph Smith. You don't have to watch the first video in order to understand this video. I will give all the context you need, but if you want to go and watch the first episode again of Joseph Smith's early life, his visions, and how the Book of Mormon was translated, I suggest pausing here, going in to watch that video. But like I said, not required. If you want to just watch from here, you're good to go. The first video was about how Joseph Smith said he saw God and Jesus Christ, and how they told him that none of the churches on the earth were true, and that they wanted him to restore the true Church of Jesus Christ onto the earth. That later became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church. In a later vision, another angel appeared to him and told him where to find the gold plates that he would then translate by what he said was the power of God into the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is essentially meant to be an addition to the Bible. So we have the New Testament, the Old Testament, and on the cover of the Book of Mormon, it says it is another testament of Jesus Christ. Essentially, Mormons believe it is in the same league as the Bible, except a little bit better because it has a better translation by Joseph Smith. I also laid out quite a bit about how Joseph Smith's early life had a lot to do with treasure digging. He would look through stones to try to find buried treasure. He would use divining rods to try to find buried treasure, and he was pretty well known in his community for being good at this treasure digging kind of thing. His first run-in with the law also had to do with treasure digging, as he was called a disorderly person for saying that he was able to find buried treasure. Joseph Smith's adolescence had a lot to do with treasure digging and with magic, mysticism, and that really primed him, historians agree, to have this experience of translating the Book of Mormon. The way he translated the Book of Mormon was by putting a rock in a hat and looking at the rock. The plates would be out of the room or off to the side in a cloth. We also discussed how the Book of Mormon did have witnesses, but most of the witnesses were his close friends and family members who had a lot to gain or lose if the Book of Mormon was proven to be false. So they had a lot of skin in the game in keeping with their witness. Some later also said that they saw the gold plates, but that they saw them with their spiritual eyes, not in the way, I see my own hand, but in the way that anyone might pray and see God. It's basically, I didn't see it at all. I just believed that it existed, which is the same as seeing it. The primary texts I'll be pulling from today include Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. This was written by Richard Bushman and is a historical account of Joseph Smith told from a faithful perspective. So him and my other author, Fawn Brody, who was a woman who was a ex-member, they both agree on most of the history, but the interpretation differs. So if you are doing a deep dive into the life of Joseph Smith, I have found it incredibly interesting to read the two accounts side by side, just because they'll talk about the same event, but highlight different aspects of the event or bring forward different interpretations of some of the same quotations. I will also lightly be touching on this book, which is called In Sacred Loneliness and is a record of the plural wives of Joseph Smith. Today's video is about the beginnings of polygamy, some of the first accountings of Joseph Smith's relations with women, and will include some of his first quotes on record about the concept of plural marriage. Joseph Smith publishes the Book of Mormon in March 1830, and then in April 1830, he organizes his church for the first time. This seems to be him truly, for the first time, fully stepping out and embracing his role as prophet, seer, and revelator. There are so many accountings of his charisma at this time and just of his ability to kind of control a room. In an account following one of these early church meetings, one of the members who was present recollects that after praying and singing, Joseph began talking. Suddenly he stopped and seemed almost transfixed. He was looking ahead and his face outshone the candle. After a short time, he turned and looked at us very solemnly and said, "Brothers and sisters, do you know who has been in your midst tonight?" Everyone looks around at each other, and Martin Harris, who's one of the most devout members at that time, says, "I know it was our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ." Joseph put his hand on Martin's head and answered, "Martin, God revealed that to you." Brothers and sisters, the Savior has been in your midst. He cast a veil over your eyes, for you could not endure to look at him. That accounting is so common for the people who were around Joseph Smith that, with a totally straight face, he would say, "I just saw Jesus Christ and you couldn't see him because you couldn't handle it." A believer would look upon that and would say, "Yeah, that sounds like a prophet of God." Other people, though, would look at this story and say that this man was essentially able to speak into existence other people's faith in him. He was able to speak with such confidence, such charisma, with all of this, imagine someone's just in a room and they stop and they stare off into space. And you can imagine someone doing this and having potentially some people being, I would say, somewhat duped into saying that must have been legit. Whereas other people look at the same experience and say, "What a liar. This man is pulling the wool over our eyes and wants me to believe that he can see God, but I can't." Convenient for him, I would think. Most of the Doctrine and Covenants and most of the revelations Joseph Smith received after founding the church are always spoken as if directly from God. And so he's not coming and saying, "Hey guys, God told me XYZ. He's saying, looking at people's eyes, "The Lord God saith unto thee." Bushman, who remember is the faithful author, said that although he served as the vital function of revealing God's word, he was thought of as an instrument. And so Bushman is more likely to play down the role of the man of Joseph Smith and places him much more as the mouthpiece of God. Also, anytime people try to get him to take back what he had said, or if they said he made an error, instead of apologizing or saying, "Maybe you're right, I did," instead he says, Who am I to go and question what God has revealed unto me? And so when he's explaining this revelatory experience to the saints, he very much is positioning himself as a mouthpiece for God and just saying, "Hey, God said I have to live in polygamy. Who am I to question God? Hey, God said we have to live the law of consecration, which means you have to give me all of your land and all of your worldly possessions. Who am I to question God? So essentially, Joseph Smith is able to reveal, which we'll get into this video, reveal a lot of very shocking or difficult things to the saints, but able to do it in such a way that they don't feel like, apparently, like he's the one asking them to live this, but rather he is also struggling with this revelation given to him by God. In my opinion, it allows him to essentially be a bit of a tyrannical leader under the guise of being a humble servant of God, which is very manipulative, but also seemed pretty effective. After the church is first organized, about 6 people were baptized, and then 8 more a week later. So the converts at the very beginning are a fairly slow stream. A month later, Joseph Smith's brother Samuel goes on a 2-week mission to try to go out and sell the Book of Mormon, and he comes back with 0 copies sold. Keeping in mind that initially the Book of Mormon was also not just a spiritual venture, it was a money-making venture. Martin Harris, who was Mormonism's first benefactor, had mortgaged his farm, his wife had left him, and so they needed to go out and sell these copies of the Book of Mormon. And the reason Martin Harris was willing to do this was not just because he believed in Joseph Smith as a prophet, but also because he saw it as an opportunity to make money. So Mormonism began as a money-making venture in addition to the founding of a church. At this early point in the organization of the church, Joseph Smith is already getting into trouble again with the law. I never heard this story before, so it was funny when I read it in both Bushman and Brody's book. Basically, as the church is organized in New York, the saints go and attempt to build a dam by the stream so that they can start doing these baptisms, because they need to be baptizing these new members. The people in the area where the church was organized already had heard these rumors of Joseph Smith being a money digger. In Brody, she says, "These men told all the gossip of the hill country about the money digger and his golden plates and the fortune teller turned baptizer." So Joseph Smith's reputation precedes him. He goes and founds his church. He attempts to do baptisms. When he goes and tries to set up this little pond where people can be baptized, the people of the community keep tearing it down, and then a mob goes and tries to get him out of his house. He has 2 trials held against him for disorderly conduct. Some people say that this is disorderly for his money digging, some for his preaching, some for kind of inciting this disagreement over the baptismal font they made in the stream. But ultimately, he is acquitted for this disorderly conduct. Joseph Smith at this point is 25, and he's already been in trouble with the law at least 3 times up to this point. At this point, Emma had not fully joined the church, and it seems that she is still hesitant to fully believe, even though, the Book of Mormon is published, she seems hesitant to fully lean into all of these things that her husband is doing. In the Doctrine and Covenants, as I said, Joseph Smith is often speaking words as if God said them. He says of Emma, God says of Emma, Joseph says of Emma, whatever you want to think, murmur not because of the things which thou hast not seen. And so to keep track, there's been a mob, there's been a boycott of the Book of Mormon, he's been in trouble with the law 3 times, there's the story of the treasure digging, she's also lost her first child, she never got to see the gold plates. And so it does seem like the resistance in Emma is mounting by the day at her husband's shenanigans as they kind of grow and grow in size. Though Emma has been baptized, she hasn't chosen to be confirmed yet, so that's receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost by the laying on of hands. And she finally says that she will be confirmed into the church, which seems to encourage Joseph Smith even more that his doctrine is true. After this whole event, they go back to Fayette, and Emma never sees her parents again, according to Brody. So Emma essentially seems like she hits this question mark point in her life after this thing with the dam and the baptisms and the mob and the law, where she tries to get Joseph to go back and farm, and she tries to get him to finally say, okay, maybe you had your little shenanigan, let's get back to farming, let's begin to build a home and a life for ourselves. Instead, though, Joseph convinces her to get confirmed, and they decide to go back to be with the saints again in Fayette, which means she fully then is cut off from her family for the rest of her life. So it seems that even though she's hesitant in those early years after marriage and is seemingly trying to convince Joseph to kind of maybe move on past this whole Book of Mormon church thing, it does seem that ultimately she decides to continue on with Joseph rather than splitting with him and maybe going back to be with her parents. Though Joseph organizes his church in 1830, it is really just the beginning of the Mormon church and all of its doctrines. At its founding, there were no temples. There was not even fully the priesthood yet, the Melchizedek priesthood, which we'll talk about. And so the organizing of the church was more like a birth than it becoming fully formed as an organization. Joseph chooses to not have any professional clergy, and any man who joins the church can be ordained to elder, apostle, priest, deacon. And so he does have this element of his church where he gives every man, specifically only men, the power and authority of God. Joseph steals these terms like prophet, apostle, elder. He really takes these, steals them, uses them, whatever you want to call it, from the Bible. Some would say that this means he's restoring the truth of Jesus Christ's church, because if these things, if these terms, these concepts, these leadership positions existed in the early church, they should now exist in the church here and now, the Church of Jesus Christ here and now. Others, though, say like just how he stole ideas from masonry, he put some of the Bible into the Book of Mormon, that he kind of continues this penchant for going out and seeing concepts, ideas, whatever in the world around him, and then integrating them into his own doctrine and belief system. An evidence of this is that Joseph Smith, like I said, used that rock to translate the Book of Mormon. He stops using the stone entirely, really past the point of the translation of the Book of Mormon, which Brody says is basically because he doesn't want there to be anything outside of himself as the ultimate source of power. So he's very good at making people feel like they have power with something like the Melchizedek priesthood, but then continuously affirming a basically authoritarian structure where he is the head, he's the prophet, he's the seer. There are some accountings of how some of Joseph's followers, Cowdery and Page, try to use these stones, but Joseph Smith said that they needed to stop, basically saying that even though these men had power from God and that the stones were powerful, that ultimately he was the one with the ability to access the full power of God. So they could have the priesthood, they could have the spirit, they could have the power of prayer, but they were not going to be able to use the stones to translate anything, because Joseph Smith was ultimately the one prophet on the earth. Not long after the founding of the church, Joseph Smith sends some of his converts on a mission to teach the Native Americans. Just a reminder, the Native Americans Joseph Smith taught are the people that are told about in the Book of Mormon. And so Joseph Smith had this theory that if he could get the Native Americans to read the Book of Mormon and to convert, it would basically be a testament to the fact that the Book of Mormon was completely legitimate and true. The Book of Mormon also has a promise that people who are more righteous have their skin turned to white. And so this seems to be an element of the early mission to the Native Americans, is that Joseph Smith, obviously in the most messed up way, thinks that they will agree to being baptized and to becoming saints or converts, and that they will do that out of a hope of greater assimilation into what was becoming the United States of America. And so Joseph Smith sends John Corrill, along with many others, on missions to go try to convert the Native Americans. So Mormon missions, I served my Mormon mission in Denver. This has always been a very strong aspect of the Mormon church, is to send people on missions. This also seems to be one of the first instances where polygamy starts to become discussed and accepted, is that Joseph Smith, as he sends people to go speak to and teach the Native Americans, in the book In Sacred Loneliness, it says, when Phillips later asked how the group in question, mostly married men, could take other wives, Smith immediately answered, this is in 1831, in the same manner Abraham took Hagar and Keturah Rebekah, that Jacob took Rachel and Bethala, I'm not saying that very well, and Zilpath by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelations, essentially saying that, hey, if you are out there and you would like to take a second wife, it's certainly in the Bible, so I see no problem with it. In another testimony of the time, Ezra Booth says, it has been made known to one who has left his wife in the state of New York that he is entirely free from his wife and is at pleasure to take him a wife from among the Lamanites being the Mormon term for Native Americans, stolen, this is the term given to them in the Book of Mormon. And so it seems from the record that polygamy is already starting to make its way into the teachings of the members of the church, though Joseph Smith has not yet taken his first plural wife, meaning his second wife. This becomes the premise for one of the reasons that the Saints end up in Missouri eventually, is that when John Curl goes, when Oliver Cowdery goes, they are out serving this mission to the Native Americans and realize that this place, Independence, specifically Missouri, is very unsettled, it's really wild, and even at this point, right at the beginning of the founding of the church, they are already on the hunt for New Jerusalem, for Zion, essentially looking for a place where all the saints can go and gather and settle down and have Zion, basically, their perfect city, perfect community. And so when Oliver Cowdery specifically goes and sees all of what's, kind of what's going on down there, he essentially reports back to Joseph Smith that this could be a good potential spot for the saints to settle eventually as their final resting place, as their New Jerusalem. It's at this point during one of these missions that a man named Sidney Rigdon joins the church. Sidney Rigdon was a Baptist preacher who was pretty established, quite a bit older than Joseph Smith, and he actually already had his own church in Kirtland, Ohio. He becomes convinced of Joseph Smith as a prophet and of the Book of Mormon, and at this point, a lot of his followers leave his church saying that he's basically been bamboozled. So a lot of them just leave him as soon as he joins Mormonism because they don't believe that it's true. But some of his more fervent believers say, okay, if Sidney's gonna join the Mormons, we will join the Mormons too. And this seems to be a pretty huge deal for Mormonism specifically, because Sidney's congregation joining the Mormons looks like it basically doubles their numbers and just makes the church be in two different places. It's in Kirtland, it's up in New York, and just broadens the horizon for Mormonism immensely. When Sidney Rigdon tries to convince Joseph to go to Ohio, and eventually Joseph Smith does agree to go, it seems that for the 60 or so converts that Joseph Smith had in New York, they were pretty upset. They basically were like, hey, we just dropped everything, we just joined, and now you're leaving to go to another state in Ohio. And just as he always says, Joseph Smith basically says, I've received a revelation. If you doubt the revelation, you doubt God. And anytime there's moments like this, it seems like there's a falling out and some of the converts leave. It really is basically like early Mormonism. As soon as people were joining, people were leaving, and the turnover was very significant. A quick reminder to like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet. This is technically part 2 of my series on Joseph Smith. So bookmark this video, bookmark the first video of my story of Joseph Smith so that you can get the whole picture. If you've recently left the Mormon Church, please consider checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church. It's basically a guide for leaving the church, how to talk to your family, different ideas or strategies or frameworks to consider as you're leaving. It took me about 2 years to write this book. It also has some of my own personal stories about leaving. And so if you are curious about my story, or if you're leaving yourself and looking for a resource to kind of help you feel supported and feel loved on your way out, consider checking it out. It seems that Sidney Rigdon joining the church was a huge ego boost for Joseph Smith, because after this happens, it seems like, he initially had a very small church, 5 members, 10 members, 20 members. A lot of those people are his family. So it probably doesn't feel totally real to him yet that he is a prophet. But once Sidney Rigdon joins, who is a Baptist preacher, he has his own congregation, this seems to give Joseph Smith a much bigger air of authority in his approach to his role as a prophet. This is a story shared by both Brody and Bushman. When Joseph Smith first appears in Ohio, which is where he's going to unite with the Rigdon believers, he walks into a store and basically introduces himself. He says, "I am Joseph the prophet," he said, smiling. "You've prayed me here. Now what do you want of me?" So, I mean, wow. The level to which he just believes this and can walk around saying it is so extreme that it's why so many people believed him. It reminds me of hearing a lot of somewhat delusional cult leaders or people who are just very charismatic leaders of any group who can decisively stare into a crowd of people and basically say, you know, "I'm a prophet," or "I have the answers to all your problems," or "the apocalypse is happening in 6 months." You know, all of these people, typically all of the believers are just going off of what they say, but they're able to say it with so much charisma and passion and authority that it does successfully get quite a few people to follow them. And if someone walks into a room and says, "Hey, you prayed me here. You've been praying for a sign from God. That's me." That is a level of confidence that many people either don't have or choose not to have because it's insanity. I also think that moving from New York, where he had this record with the law, he had this record of treasure digging, which seemed to follow him around whenever he moved within the state borders of New York, him going to Kirtland allows him to break away from this for the first time. So he's no longer just associated with his teenage persona of treasure digger, but now he steps into Kirtland and assumes these followers that Rigdon has amped up for him and prepared for him, who fully view him as a prophet and are ready to follow him, versus a mixture of his family and friends from New York who were willing to join him because of a lot of personal connections. Joseph Smith's ability to proclaim something and then basically say, "Take it or leave it, but I'm not going to walk back what I said," gives him an air of authority. This personal belief in himself that he can see everything, he can translate anything, gives him the air of authority needed to begin working on the Book of Abraham, the Book of Moses, the Book of Mormon. All of these are just different moments that he chose to translate or receive revelation. Same with his Book of Commandments. He's essentially kind of continuously writing and working on these translated works, these revelations, and very much posing them as being directly from God. He also becomes inspired to revise the Bible in 1831, so about a year after the founding of the church. Basically, coming back to the Bible and saying, "I'm now using the same gift that I was using to translate the Book of Mormon to now revise the Bible to be more accurate as to what God wants it to say." In the book In Sacred Loneliness, this also seems to be another crucial moment where he starts thinking about polygamy. He said that the doctrine of celestial marriage, meaning polygamy, was revealed to him, Joseph Smith, while he was engaged on the work of the translation of the scriptures, meaning Smith's inspired revision of the Bible. Historian Daniel Bachman suggests that this occurred in February 1831. And so Joseph Smith is going through revising the Bible. At this time, he's also coming up with terms like priest, prophet, deacon. It seems that combing back through the Bible and choosing to revise it also gave him the idea for polygamy and basically allows him to continue to supplement Mormonism with other ideas from the Bible. Bushman says that this choice to revise the Bible is essentially a striking demonstration of his outrageous confidence. And so, I mean, Joseph Smith at this point is 26, and this young man is essentially saying, the Bible isn't totally correct, and I am the one to revise it into perfection. I don't think there's been many people on the face of the planet who can, with a straight face, say, I have the gift and power of God, and I can use that to retranslate, re-revise, to fix the Bible. That definitely shows his ability to believe in himself for sure, and to probably get other people to believe in him too. By the time Joseph and Emma get to Kirtland itself has been settled for about 20 years. And this now means that there are 150 converts, mostly because of the Sidney Rigdon congregation joining, plus those who converted through Joseph Smith. So we see, in the first year or so, Joseph Smith's church goes from 0 to 150. And in Kirtland, there are many admirers, as I said. It seems, though, that a lot of these admirers were also a little crazy. So there's, convulsions, speaking in tongues. Suddenly someone says that they can't move. Someone else says they just saw the devil and God and an angel. And it seems that this new congregation that joins Joseph Smith's original group is a lot more fiery and maybe slightly more wild than the people who had joined him in New York. Joseph Smith seems to be able to use the Book of Mormon, but also Sidney Rigdon's testimony of him to kind of get a hold of these new converts and basically say, hey, look, I have this book. It basically provided him something tangible to show and prove that he was a prophet. So I like the analysis that Brody gives, that basically in the early days, the Book of Mormon was a huge asset to Joseph's power and authority as prophet, that he could point to and say, this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that God trusted me to translate this book of scripture, which ironically later would be a huge stumbling block for people joining the church in the modern age, because we have so much more science, we have DNA evidence, we have significantly more proof in archaeology, we have people who can decipher Egyptian, and so what was once a great asset to Mormonism slowly but surely would become a huge way that the church was crippled. During this time, Joseph Smith also starts talking a lot about the second coming. He definitely is phrasing it like it's imminent. I think every religious leader of any offshoot group seems to basically say that the second coming is imminent. He declares the first 12 apostles during this time, and he prophesies that some of the 12 would see the second coming of Christ, which obviously did not happen because that was a long time ago and they all died. I will definitely share that it is ironic and funny to me now that there were so many prophecies I heard that Joseph Smith made that came true, but I certainly never heard of all of the prophecies he made, like the 12 would see the second coming of Christ, that I definitely never heard about. It also seems that during this time, Joseph Smith, just like what happened with Sidney Rigdon, this happens with these groups of converts too, where as Emma, as other people express belief in him, he grows in a greater belief in himself. So it seems like it's this vicious cycle where basically he says something, other people believe it, and so by them believing it, he believes his own prophecy too, and believes even more so that he is led by God. There are also a lot of instances where people will demand to see a miracle or demand some sort of hard evidence. A lot of these early converts would say like, hey, can you prove it? Can you show us, show us the gold plates, show us the Urim and Thummim, show us evidence of XYZ of your authority, heal this person. And often he would just say that if you are demanding for a miracle or demanding hard evidence, that actually is a sign that you're not having enough faith. So it seems like, just like with a lot of religion, there's always a logical loophole out of having to show proof, because if you need proof, then you didn't have enough faith. Or if I say, I just saw Jesus Christ in my room right now, if you didn't see him, it's because you didn't have sufficient faith, or it's because Christ veiled your eyes because you're not ready to see him. It reminds me of the Christopher Hitchens quote, famous atheist, which he says, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so essentially, if you can say, hey, I just just saw God and I don't have to give you any evidence, then I can also dismiss it and say, no, you didn't. And I don't have to give you proof that you didn't, because often a lot of, especially what Joseph Smith was saying, was definitely him asserting things without giving any proof. Just like Bushman said, he's saying, thus saith the Lord, and you can take it or leave it, but he's not making any sort of attempt to help your belief or to support your belief with evidence. He's just saying, if you don't believe it, that's on you. We also see during this time that Joseph Smith seems to be inventing this idea of Zion and of his utopia. And this is around the time in 1831 that the idea of the law of consecration starts up amongst the saints. So the law of consecration is essentially that everyone must give everything they possess to the church, and then the church meets back what each person needs according to their needs, their life, whatever. So basically, this law of consecration, I think, can really be taken one of two ways. One is that Joseph is trying to, he was raised in poverty, his parents are poor, and so he's trying to create a system under which, Brody compares this to Marxism, basically that everyone is equal, everyone has the same amount of land, or this, same amount according to their need. And it's this beautiful utopia where no one is poor, but no one is rich either. The other flip-flop of this is that Joseph Smith, the tyrannical leader, is basically saying, hey, give me all your stuff, because ultimately the church is him. He is the church as the leader. Give the church all your stuff and you'll get a meager portion in return. And, that's the way God wants it to be. Joseph Smith apparently taught that inequality poisons society, which is funny because even though inequality poisons society and all the members are taught, hey, give everything you own to the church, he also is teaching authoritarianism, which is that only he can speak to God, only he can do translations, only he can lead the church in the way it needs to be led. And so it's very interesting that he's preaching this very equality-centered doctrine of the law of consecration. Nobody's rich, nobody's poor, but also he has absolute power. The saints should follow him completely, and that no one can question. And if they do question, they're kicked out of the church. It definitely begs the question if Joseph Smith is truly planning a utopia or if he's just planning to take everybody's shit. During this time, there were two men named Ezra Thayer and Layman Copley, and they committed a 1,000-acre tract to the New York Saints as consecration for them to live on. Basically saying, hey, we have this extra land, we believe in the law of consecration, and so you can have this 1,000 acres so that when the converts start coming from New York to Ohio, they have a place to live, and we are just going to give this to you as part of the law of consecration. This leads us to the very first General Conference of the church, which happens on June 4th, 1831, and apparently is very disastrous. They had been doing some quarterly conferences, but this is, I guess, the first attempt at a general conference for all the saints. Apparently, this conference had been talked about and hyped up for weeks beforehand as a moment where, there was going to be revelation and the Spirit would visit everyone, and it was going to be very exciting. This conference was supposed to be this miraculous event. So they said that there's going to be, an outpouring of God's power. There's going to be miracles taking place, revelations happening, but it really doesn't go that way. So some of the men during this meeting are ordained to be high priests, and it seems like the emotions are running high. One man was suddenly stricken deaf and dumb. Joseph strode over to him and commanded the devil to flee, and immediately the lost senses were returned. The whole congregation was electrified. So basically it sounds like Everyone had been excited and waiting for this conference for a very long time, weeks beforehand. Joseph Smith miraculously heals this man who was suddenly stricken deaf and dumb. Sounds like if you can be suddenly stricken deaf and dumb, you maybe can be suddenly unstricken deaf and dumb. According to one account, Joseph was so excited that he lost all discretion. Seeking a convert's hand, which had been crippled by an accident, he cried, "Brother Murdoch, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to straighten your hand," and tugged at the stiff curled fingers. Again he demanded it, but the fingers merely returned to their old distortion. This up next is the craziest portion. This is confirmed by many accounts that of people who were there. A father brought in a dead child whom he had refused to bury until after the conference. Basically, this child had passed away, but they had put off burying him because they heard of this conference. They knew that Joseph Smith was going to be full of the Spirit, and they had this hope that Joseph Smith would be able to make their child rise from the dead. The most earnest and frantic prayers left the tiny gray body motionless. Joseph found it impossible to reproach the parents for lack of faith, since they were the last to be convinced that the child could not be made to breathe again. Finally, numb and desolate, they turned on the elders and reproached them bitterly for having advised against medical aid. A chill spread over the whole conference. So it sounds like what was supposed to be this religious revival, this coming together of the New York and Ohio saints, turned out to be this moment where Joseph Smith could not deliver on the miraculous event that maybe he had hoped for, that others had hoped for as well. The outcome of this conference was fairly significant. As a result of this conference, the two men who had offered the 1,000-acre tract of land rescinded the offer, and anyone who had moved there up to that point, they said that they were trespassing and, basically made them leave this land that they had promised. A lot of people who were present at the conference, at this meeting, started to question Joseph Smith. One of Booth's friends, Booth was one of the men who has one of the primary testimonies of this conference. One of his friends left because his name was misspelled in a revelation, which may seem small, but if the revelation, if Joseph Smith is literally a mouthpiece for God, then why is the man's name misspelled? Maybe because Joseph Smith is just saying whatever he thinks, because if he's really a conduit for God, he probably wouldn't be misspelling someone's name because God should know the spelling of the name. Bushman explains that Booth was just one of many to drop away. 11 of the 63 attendees at this conference denied the faith or were cut off within a few years, and another dozen attendees left later. So it basically sounds like almost half of the people who were in attendance that day ultimately decided to leave. That's from Bushman. Bushman's the faithful author. And so it seems clear that, when the rubber was supposed to hit the road with Joseph Smith being a prophet and bringing people back to life, doing miracles, having what he said was the truth come to pass, having all these people see the face of God, when none of that happened, quite a few people said, that must mean Joseph Smith is a fraud, and so they decided to leave. There also seems to be quite a lot of questioning around the power of Joseph Smith as a prophet. There's moments where, he can say to somebody who is spontaneously deaf, "Get your hearing back," and they're fine. There's also moments where he'll tell an older lady, "Stand up and walk," and she's able to stand up and walk. And it does seem like there's moments where he has miracles where everybody is so overwhelmed and shocked and surprised and feels so much faith. But then there's also other instances that maybe seem more personally serious to Joseph Smith, that he is completely powerless. So Emma lost their first baby, but then when she's pregnant with twins and she gives birth in Ohio, those twins also die, which means of Emma's first 3 children, all 3 have died. And so even though he kind of can have these miraculous moments, he also has moments in his personal life that, he's not able to keep the law from arresting him necessarily. He's not able to keep converts from turning away from him. He's not able to bless his wife to have healthy babies. And so there's this push and pull where some people would say, oh, well, if he can't work miracles in these ways, he's probably not a prophet. And others say, his faith was being tested. The faith of the converts, of the saints, were being tested. So it's really whatever side of the aisle you happen to be on with how you interpret these events. I do think this is a good moment to pitch the song Thank You God by Tim Minchin, which is a hilarious song about kind of this idea of people being, religious leaders being able to heal others under the guise of the power of God. The song, however, is not for maybe the most faint of heart because it's about atheism. So only listen, if you don't mind listening to that. But it's a hilarious song. I definitely think it's funny. I definitely suggest listening to it and reading the lyrics. After the twins pass away, there's another mother in the community who has twins around the same time, and the mother passes away from complications during childbirth. And so as a result, Emma and Joseph adopt those two twins. So those are their first kind of adopted children. In 1831, Joseph Smith also visits Independence, basically with the intent to check out the area that Oliver Cowdery had been pitching him on. He's surprised that they're not more converts, but this ultimately is the place where Joseph Smith decides to try to set up Zion. They make plans to start buying land, and by 1833, 1,200 saints were in the area. In 1831, it had 20 dwellings total. So there's a lot of conversation around why people in Missouri did not like the Mormons. I think it's probably fairly safe to say that the Mormons basically drew a place on the map and said, we're all going here. And the people who were already there felt overwhelmed and felt like their community, to some extent, was being overrun by these religious fanatics. In 1832, in March, Joseph Smith is taken from his bedroom, knocked out. They tried to poison him, tarred and feathered him, and then they basically left him for dead, and he goes back to his house. This also happens to Sidney Rigdon and seems to be, to some extent, a result of this conference that had gone very poorly. This tar and feathering is also what was shown at the beginning of this video. As the narrator said, were they mad because of the doctrine? Were they mad because, there were so many members coming into this area? I also mentioned that they said that they were going to try to castrate Joseph Smith. The reason for the castration is said to be that Joseph Smith might have been getting involved with a girl named Nancy. He and Emma were staying at a family called the Johnsons, and Nancy was one of the daughters. Basically, the reason, and basically one of the brothers of Nancy was upset and incited this mob to try to go get Joseph Smith and castrate him and basically put this whole Mormon thing to an end. Bushman disagrees and said that this probably isn't the reason they were trying to castrate him, though he does state that accounts say that he was, they did attempt to castrate him. So I think if, Bushman is like, yeah, they probably did try to castrate him, but it wasn't because of Nancy, Brody, of course, disagrees and says that this was a major reason that this mob was trying to get Joseph Smith out of the house. Another reason that this mob might have been incited was by Booth, who was somebody who left after the conference. He had written letters to the Ohio Star, which is a newspaper, and basically saying Joseph Smith was a treasure digger, saying that Joseph Smith wanted to start Zion in order to have total control over his followers and isolate them. Another note about Nancy is that she did later become one of his wives. So even if this event with him getting with her during this time in 1832, even if that's incorrect, she did later marry him in a polygamous relationship later on. Joseph Smith talked to Lyman Johnson, who he was living with at the time, about polygamy in 1831. Morinda was Johnson's daughter and would later become one of his wives, as I said. He told a Apostle Orrin Pratt that Joseph had made known to him as early as 1831 that plural marriage was a correct principle, but the time had not yet come to teach and practice it. Smith was living in the Johnson household while making his revision of the Old Testament, which I told you guys about, so Lyman's testimony is valuable. And so polygamy already was on the table in 1831. This tar and feathering is happening in 1832. I honestly think that this could be the first true record of Joseph Smith's infidelity with this girl named Nancy. They were certainly living at the house at the time. He later married this girl. There's definitely different accounts from different people about the castration aspect of this tar and feathering. And so it's not the craziest thing that this might have been one of the dimensions of what made this event happen. During the tarring and feathering, one of the little baby twins who was adopted died. This, they think, was from either measles, or some say it was because the baby was exposed to cold air because the door was left open after they took Joseph out, and the baby was left alone in the cold, and that is what contributed to it passing away about a week later. It's unclear. It's kind of, to me, this story of the tarring and feathering is one of many major events in the life of Joseph Smith where, depending on your view of him, it could be taken in wildly different directions. On the one hand, we have a prophet and seer of the Lord who is persecuted by the evil men who don't believe in his teachings, and as a result, he is beaten nearly to death, and his new adopted baby dies. That's scenario one. On the other hand, we have a man who is secretly having this strange affair, extramarital affair with this girl, Nancy, who he's living with. He's kind of getting with her in private. Certainly he went with Emma in private as well, behind Emma's father's back. And that when this little affair is found out, the mob is incited. They come and try to castrate Joseph. As a result of Joseph's infidelity and because of the violence that comes against him because he couldn't keep it in his pants, one of his new adopted babies died, and his wife is thrown back into heartache. I mean, those two accountings of that same event, of the tarring and feathering, both Brody and Bushman, ex-Mormon and faithful Mormon, they all agree that Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered. They all agree that castration was mentioned. They disagree as to why they were motivated to do these things. Just so I don't leave you hanging, this is how the movie Joseph Smith, the Prophet of the Restoration, made by the Mormon Church, this is how they show what happened after Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered.
God has restored to the earth the spirit of prophecy and of revelation. I am a witness that Jesus is the Christ. He invites all men to repent and to come unto him. He will bear our grief. He will carry our burdens.
And this was the portion of the tar and feathering that I was always told, which is that even though Joseph Smith had faced this intense and crazy amount of persecution, that the next morning he woke up and he still went to teach in front of the congregation. And then apparently some say that some of the people who were in the mob went that morning to hear him preach and were converted because of his, righteous testimony. As you can see, they're kind of hinting at with the man that, is in the background. As the trouble with the mobs continue, Joseph Smith hastens his plans to go to Independence. He visits there again. While he's there, he starts his very own newspaper called the Evening and Morning Star in February 1832. I think he's seen how the printing press has been used against him in the past, so maybe proactively he thinks, before I get to Independence, I will start my own printing press, which gives me a little bit more power to spread the word. It seems too that there is a little bit of discord between the Missouri saints and the saints who are in Kirtland. Joseph Smith is spending most of his time in Kirtland. All of the major leadership is in Kirtland, but a lot of the most faithful saints have given up everything, consecrated everything, and gone to live in Missouri in order to start to build Zion. So we see definitely this kind of inequity here where Missouri is going to be Zion, but the church headquarters is still very much in Kirtland, and this seems to cause some discord. Also, as people kind of lose faith once they are in Missouri, they sue, and the government will give them their land back. And so there seems to be quite a bit of discord happening with the law of consecration happening, in Missouri specifically. It seems like it's kind of the Wild West of Mormonism at this point, because Joseph Smith is occasionally visiting the people down there, but mostly the people are left to fend for themselves while being also asked to give up everything. So it's just kind of a power vacuum. Just a reminder to like this video, leave a comment if anything has stood out to you. Don't forget to subscribe. This is part 2 of my series on Joseph Smith. We are making our way through what is a very long book, and I feel like I could title this YouTube series, I Read Rough Stone Rolling and No Man Knows My History and In Sacred Loneliness, so that you don't have to. Sometimes that's why it's taking me a bit of time between these videos, because it's a lot of reading, and I'm not just looking at this, I'm looking at a lot of different other sources, many of which I will link below, that are just Wikipedia pages and records directly from the LDS Church. So it's a lot of information to figure out. So if you appreciate the content, please drop a comment and smash that like button, as they say. Joseph Smith heads back up to Kirtland again. It seems like whenever he leaves one place, the other area falls into more chaos. Sidney Rigdon bursts into a church meeting and demands that he should get a house. It's funny to read in Bushman, because Bushman is very dismissive, basically saying that Joseph Smith was so kind to not just toss Sidney Rigdon to the side, because Sidney Rigdon becomes so kind of angry that he doesn't have a home yet. But, Sidney Rigdon really helped him start his congregation. He gave him all of his followers, and he's lived the law of consecration, and he still doesn't even have his own house for his big family. So I don't think he's complaining for no reason. Joseph Smith in 1832 also travels to New York City. He's pretty inspired by New York City. This is his first time going to such a major metropolitan area in his entire life. After he goes to New York City, he begins making even bigger dreams and instructions and plans for his city of Zion. And the instruction he lays out, he wants it to be a city of 15 to 20,000 people, it's very funny to read some of Joseph Smith's writing about New York, because he's at once, very inspired, but he also simultaneously very much talks down on the people of New York City, basically calling them sinners and people, people of the world, that kind of a thing. During this time, Andrew Jackson is also the president, and he essentially prays that South Carolina will not be so rebellious, and essentially Andrew Jackson starts putting stuff out that he's trying to keep a civil war from happening. And during this time, Joseph Smith is in New York. He's hearing all of this talk of civil war, and Joseph Smith, makes a prophecy that there will be a civil war between the North and South states of America. This is very funny, because growing up, I always heard of this prophecy of Joseph Smith as one of the sure evidences that Joseph Smith could see the future. He was a prophet of God because he could foretell this future in which there would be a civil war. Ironically, though, there's quite a bit of evidence to share. Andrew Jackson included, to show that many people were foretelling a civil war. Tensions were incredibly hot during that time. And really, there was just enough ongoing turmoil between the North and South over slavery and over economics that it didn't take a prophecy from God to say that there might be a civil war, keeping in mind that Joseph Smith also said that, the second coming of Christ was at hand, and that many of his followers would be on the earth when Jesus Christ came again. So it's just funny to me rereading that portion of Bushman talking about this Andrew Jackson situation with the Civil War, because I was always taught that the Civil War prophecy was one of the many proofs that Joseph Smith was a true prophesying prophet. And actually, it was just evidence that he was reading the newspaper. On November 6th, 1832, Emma gives birth to the 4th child. This is the first to live into adulthood, and they name name this child Joseph. So Joseph's dad is named Joseph. Joseph's named Joseph. Joseph names his first living son Joseph. It is Joseph's all the way down. This Joseph being the fourth child and the first one to live into adulthood, would later become one of the leaders of the branches to split off of Mormonism after the prophet Joseph Smith dies. A few days after this birth, Brigham Young enters the scene, which is interesting that these two future leaders of branches of Mormonism enter the scene around the same, within a few days of each other. Brigham Young already was a convert at that point. A lot of converts converted at this point before ever meeting Joseph Smith. They merely converted based off of the Book of Mormon and the testimonies of the missionaries who were going to all these different states proclaiming the gospel. It seems that Brigham Young, during this first time meeting, doesn't have a lot of writings of his impressions of Joseph Smith, which Bushman takes to mean that Brigham Young was not converted to just a man of the prophet, but he was converted to the gospel, the restored gospel. I think it means that Brigham Young wasn't going to go off writing about how Joseph Smith was cool because Brigham Young was too proud. I don't know. In another ironic turn of this idea of the law of consecration, Joseph Smith gets a house and a beautiful 140-acre farm, while many of his Missouri converts live with very, very little. As I said, Sidney Rigdon didn't even have a house. So what a utopia. Surprise, surprise, the leader of the movement has a nice house and a big farm and 140 acres, and a lot of the people who had given up everything that they possessed to the church were living with very, very little. So that seems, just about how it usually goes when somebody says, I'm the leader, I will make everything good for everyone, and then somehow has their own yacht and their own jet. I shared in a video last week about my own family history in Mormonism with Sanford Porter. My ancestors was one of the saints who went to Missouri. So I feel like my ancestor was definitely on the periphery of this whole Mormon movement. After he joined, he moved to Missouri to go live the law of consecration. So it seems that the hub of the church surrounding Joseph was in Kirtland for quite a while. Late into the late 1830s, but my ancestor basically moved to Missouri immediately in hopes of helping to found Zion. So it kind of seems like the saints who were in the inner circle were surrounded with Joseph Smith up in Kirtland, and the rank and file members, the average saint was more likely to be in Missouri, further away from the prophet. In December 1832, Joseph Smith organizes the School of the Prophets. This is his, continues to be his inner circle. They testify to each other. This is, his most trusted group of people. This is also where the word of wisdom comes into existence, mostly because of Emma. It seems that a lot of the people who were surrounding Joseph weren't very refined. I've shared about how a lot of the early saints who were kind of crazy enough to join the Mormon movement also would, burst into spasms and speak in tongues and say they were deaf and then say they weren't deaf anymore, be visited by Satan or angels, whatever. And so it sounds like some of these people were fairly rough. And there's this story, which is also shared by both Bushman and Brody, that basically, and this is what I learned growing up, that a lot of the men were chewing tobacco and spitting, and it got on the ladies' skirts. And so Emma is basically like, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And then Joseph gets this revelation about the word of wisdom, which we now have today in the church. Members have me no more, no coffee, no tobacco, drinking. Initially, it seems that the word of wisdom was just kind of a general health code, and the way that it's been interpreted by the church over time has changed significantly. It hasn't always been part of the temple recommend questions. Joseph Smith drank wine throughout his life and alcohol in general. So it seems that the goal initially was just to kind of say, hey, stop spitting tobacco at the skirts of these women. and then later was transformed into the reason I didn't have coffee till I was like 23. In 1833, the members start building the Mormon temple, the very first temple, which will be in Kirtland. A lot of people say Joseph Smith stole the concept of temples from masonry. There obviously are many Masonic temples all around. I'll include a picture of the outside of one here. Masonic temples are fairly secretive. You can only go to their ceremonies if you're a member. A lot of the symbology is similar. There's the compass, there's the right angle, there's the garments, there's the temple robes. So a lot of the administration of the ceremony is very similar. To prepare for this video, I did watch a video, which I'll put what it looks like here and I'll link it below too. This is what the church shares as its official narrative about Mormons and Masonry. One thing I think they leave out of this video though, or that they kind of obfuscate, is basically that Joseph Smith's dad was heavily involved in Masonry since I believe about 1818, so long before even Joseph Smith had penned the first word of the Book of Mormon, and his father's very involved, his brother's also involved, and so it basically makes it out to be that Joseph Smith didn't really take any of this from Masonry, and if he did, he only took the inspired parts, just like he took the inspired parts of the Bible to put into the Book of Mormon. If his dad has been involved in Masonry, his family's involved in Masonry, while they're even still in New York when he's just a teenager, it does seem fairly silly in my mind to say that Masonry has no relation to the temple. There are just so many similarities. I think it's fairly clear that just as Joseph Smith was very good at borrowing from many, he borrowed from Native American culture, he borrowed from the Bible, he borrowed from Masonry, he borrowed from scientific terms of the time, he borrowed from the art, the landscape of the time. He was a master, in my opinion, at looking around him, seeing things that stood out to him, things that inspired him, things that felt noteworthy, and boiling it together and mishmashing it together in a way that felt more inspired, more pure, more beautiful to the people who believed that he was a prophet. Speaking of reading, I have also been working my way through Method Infinite, which is a book about Freemasonry and the Mormon Restoration. This is a book that was recommended to me by the ex-Mormon subreddit about this, and I do plan on doing in the future a video that is much more specific about Masonry and about the Mormon temple, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that. As I said, Joseph Smith was working at this time at revising the Bible. As he's revising, he's taking terms like prophet, priest, apostle. He's seeing, he's already seen terms like Urim and Thummim. He also has used some of the Bible for the Book of Mormon. And in the School of the Prophets, they begin with foot washing. As you probably know, if you're familiar with the Bible, Jesus Christ washed the feet of his disciples. So as he's doing the revision, I think he's revisiting some of these concepts in the Bible, and he begins cobbling together things from the Bible that he can then bring into the temple. The building of the temple was incredibly expensive, which meant the saints had even less to go around, and in a crazy attempt to, build on both ends, Joseph Smith is trying to build a temple in Missouri and Kirtland. So keep in mind, he has a big farm. He has this grand vision of these two temples in these two states, and there's a lot of leaders even in his congregation who don't have homes or who are leaving getting their land back because they don't feel that the law of consecration is being meted out fairly. The temple building is not only very expensive, it's also labor intensive. On July 23rd, Joseph Smith announces that the members are supposed to consecrate 1 in 7 days as a requirement for laboring at the temple. On July 23rd, in 1833, the cornerstones are put in place. So it's not only just expensive monetarily, it's also, they had to buy supplies, buy everything that's going to go into the temple. They're also being asked to dedicate 1 in 7 days as labor on top of what they've already consecrated. So I see a lot of through lines to Mormonism, because Mormonism is very demanding of your time, your 10% of your resources, resources, your fast offerings, buying garments, buying temple clothes, paying for youth camps. I mean, I can go on and on about that. So I think that this aspect of money going towards these temples definitely is setting up the later $100+ billion fund the Mormon Church has today, because they are very good at gathering money and keeping it in the hands of the church. Basically, right after Joseph Smith says we're going to have a temple in Independence, there is trouble in Missouri. There's mobs, and at that point, Mormons made up of 1/3 of Jackson County. It seems that as the members are streaming in, there's more and more dissonance between members and non-members. In a revelation which is dictated by Joseph Smith, but he says it comes directly from God, the current residents of Missouri of Independence are described as enemies. So it seems that fairly early on, there's already starting to be issues. I think that if a religious sect turns up to your small community in droves and says, this is our promised land, it actually belongs to us, and we are going to have 20,000 people come here, it may lead to some people who already live there getting a little freaked out. So I think we can see both sides. I feel like I can see both sides here, though it does seem that some of the actions made by the non-Mormons was out of a bit of hysteria. They ruined the printing press, they smashed the press itself, and they tarred and feathered Bishop Partridge, who was one of the main leaders of the Missouri sect. To read from Bushman, the Mormon presence in Jackson County, Missouri, as in every other county they occupied during the next 15 years, tested democracy. The Mormon case illustrated an underlying democratic dilemma. Can a majority in defense of the public good, as they see it, strip a minority of its rights? The Jackson County citizens believed their procedures were democracy in action. The citizens came together to prevent a social and political disaster of alarming proportions. In their view, they acted purely in self-defense. So if you're on the non-Mormon side, you see a group of people who have set up shop and made their homes, who suddenly have a bunch of people turning up who say, this is our land, and we're going to outvote you and put our religious leaders into political positions. But on the other side, he says, but for the Mormons, Jackson County democracy meant repression and expulsion. Under the terms of the agreement, Mormons could not vote, could not own property, could not print a newspaper, and could not work in the county. We see the Mormons calling non-Mormons enemies, and that God is even calling them enemies, and we see that the non-members are saying, hey, we want to keep things as they are. This also continues the narrative that Joseph Smith has been experiencing basically since he was first, questioned about his treasure digging, that he is under religious persecution for being a prophet. During this time of Joseph going back and forth between Missouri and Ohio, enters the stage Fanny Alger. I shared a little bit about the quote from Joseph Smith about marrying the Native Americans potentially during that mission. I also shared about the quote to Brother Johnson about how polygamy was okay in 1831. And so there's been little whisperings of it. We also have the occasion of Nancy Morinda, which I shared, and the castration episode that happened in 1832. Which he then did later marry her as one of his plural wives. And so there's kind of this ongoing through line of polygamy that is bubbling up, that's mentioned here and there in a little bit in the Book of Mormon, mentioned as he revises the Bible, but we haven't seen yet a specific case of polygamy. So Fanny Alger is kind of the first moment where true polygamy seems to rear its ugly head. I will say there is no first-person testimony either from Alger herself or from Joseph Smith about this, but there is definitely enough discussion of their relationship that historians all agree that there was something that happened. Some say that this relationship between Joseph and Alger was some sort of a extramarital affair. Some refer to it as his first polygamist relationship. And then there is also people contemporary of the time disagreeing, if this was of God, if this was just Joseph, misusing his power. Historians also disagree as to when this was happening. So if it if it was when she was 16 in 1833, or if it was a little bit later on in 1834 or 35. That date, as the date changes, it also changes her age. So some say she was as young as 16. Some say she was more like 19, because there's people disagreeing, and because it was also very secretive, it's hard to know the exact truth. I will be going with what the author of this book basically shares his conclusions are. But as I said, there are a lot of different testimonies and a lot of different people with different levels of skin in the game who have differing opinions. So I'll be sharing what is shared in this book and what I read from my research online. I suggest, if you're curious, to continue to do your own independent research. The record used in Sacred Loneliness comes from Mosiah Hancock. Mosiah's father was Levi, and Fanny was Levi's niece. So he was very close to the family in the situation, and this man, Levi, also was in Kirtland from 1832 to 1833. So he there's a lot of reasons that he goes into as to why we can trust him as a narrator, as sharing what happened in this event. Basically, Fanny was working in the family home for Emma and for Joseph. She was some sort of a servant, basically. Most people just seem to refer to Fanny Alger as either an affair or as a plural marriage. I think if in today's day and age we had a 27-year-old man sleeping with a 16-year-old, I don't think we would call it either plural marriage or an affair. We would call it RAPE because she's underage and she's not able to give consent because she's a child. So there is also that aspect of this. I feel like every time, the polygamy is discussed, I feel like often when polygamy is discussed, it's basically like the power dynamic is totally equal. Like, Fanny said that she would marry Joseph at 16. And so who are we to basically find anything in that other than if she wanted to, she should be able to do it. But I know if now a 16-year-old said they wanted to marry a 27-year-old, that would be held quite differently. Compton puts the date of the marriage around February or March of 1833. Some people refer to Joseph Smith's plural marriages as dynastic, essentially meaning that they are tying themselves in, and even the parents are becoming tied in with the prophet. So it's not just Fanny that's going to be sealed to Joseph for time and all eternity, but it's also her parents. And so it's basically a way to confirm that you are Mormon royalty, basically. That's, I think, that word dynastic is referring to becoming part of this very hallowed, special, chosen people through this marriage. One of the most telling aspects of this marriage, though, is the character of Levi. Levi helps secure Fanny Alger for Joseph in return for Joseph securing a 17-year-old named Clarissa Reed for himself. So we see here that there is this exchange of women that takes place, which I think elevates it to be a much more sinister perspective, where basically Joseph Smith and brother Levi are swapping women with each other. So Joseph says, hey, if you get me Fanny Alger, then I will get you Clarissa Reed and I will allow you to have her. And that's how polygamy continues throughout Joseph Smith's life, where as men help him secure women for him, he then helps those men secure women for themselves. So polygamy is very much held in a very tight inner circle within the church, because there's this exchange of women as property, basically. It also makes it so that these men are less likely to leave because they're all in on this secret. And it means that they are all getting rewarded with these women for staying faithful to Joseph Smith, for helping him secure multiple wives, because it means that they in turn will be given greater leadership opportunities and they will be given young brides of their own. To read from In Sacred Loneliness, having obtained his niece Fanny for Joseph, Levi escorted her to the prophet and a marriage ceremony took place. Mosiah's narrative, if accepted, thus negates interpretations of a liaison, or that he was having some sort of extramarital affair with her. Levi Hancock received his reward. Smith sanctioned his marriage to Clarissa, which took place on March 29th, 1833. Mosiah's narrative suggests that the Smith-Alger marriage occurred first, so Joseph probably married Fanny in February or March 1833 when she was 16 and he was 27. So we've discussed kind of the faithful narrative of this Fanny and Joseph relationship. While Joseph seems to be very much either bought into Fanny as a romantic prospect or sexual prospect, or if he's just bought in as a religious, second wife, living the law of plural marriage dynamic, Joseph is bought in. Joseph is fully involved with Fanny. Joseph's wife, Emma, though, is not. This is an accounting from Anne Eliza Webb Young, who is a woman who was one of Brigham Young's plural wives and later left the church. Mrs. Smith had an adopted daughter, a very pretty, pleasing young girl, about 17 years old. Eliza continues, consequently, it was with shocked surprise that people heard that Sister Emma had turned Fanny out of the house in the night. It was felt that she, Emma, certainly must have had some very good reason for her action. So we see that Emma and Fanny seem to be very close and to be described as having kind of a mother-daughter relationship. And then suddenly, Emma turns Fanny out of the house in the middle of the night. By degrees, it became whispered that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was by no means a paternal affection, and that his wife, discovering the fact, at once took measures to place the girl beyond his reach. In another letter by a man named William McClellan, who was sharing a story that Emma told him, again I told her, Emma, I heard that one night she missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me that this story was verily true. So we see that there's this, this moment where Emma catches a transaction between Joseph and Fanny. Of course, some believing members who very much love Joseph Smith will say, well, that transaction could have been, a handshake. And Emma was probably just a sensitive lady anyways, like all women are sensitive. But it seems that combined with Oliver Cowdery's testimony that it was a dirty and nasty affair, definitely seems to be that Joseph was sleeping with Fanny, his adopted daughter / maid or house servant. There definitely seems to be enough evidence to show that whatever Joseph felt about this relationship with Fanny, be it polygamous relationship ordained by God or just an affair, Emma did not approve, and she did not accept that this was going to be her new reality. There are also hints that Fanny is pregnant. At one point, it's said that she was unable to hide the consequences of their relationship, seeming to mean that potentially she was pregnant. She was sent away. Later, she was completely sent away to live with a different family. It seems that Joseph stays somewhat connected to Fanny over the next few years. Oliver Cowdery was later excommunicated expressly for speaking out against the relationship between Fanny and Joseph, which is kind of crazy because Cowdery served as scribe for the Book of Mormon. He was one of the founding leadership members of the church. He was one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. And Oliver Cowdery had stayed with Joseph Smith for a very, very long time. And so for him to be excommunicated expressly because he was speaking out against this relationship between Fanny and Joseph Smith seems to me very telling of the nature of this relationship between the two people. This now concludes part 2 of my story about Joseph Smith. There's so much information to try to get through on these topics. Coming up in the next installment of this series, we are going to hear about Joseph Smith leading a military expedition to Missouri to help assist the Latter-day Saints who were there. We're going to be talking a lot more about polygamy. Fanny Alger and Nancy are completely just the beginning. Joseph Smith, by the end of his life, was sealed to more than 30 women. Many of them were already married to other men, and many of them were underage. So we're going to get into all of that. More temples are going to be built. There's going to be a lot more drama in Missouri with Governor Boggs, and they're going to move to Palmyra. So I'm not gonna rush us through this experience, because to rush and to not understand feels like it's glossing over really important, what I feel like is history that's important, interesting history about a man that I've heard his name since before I can remember, that somehow I've never heard most of the history about this man that I've heard about all my life. So if you want to keep following along, I am going to eventually make this into a formal playlist. I will link here once I have part 3 out. If you want to go back now and rewatch part 1, now is a great time to do that. So you can be a completist on the life of Joseph Smith. Really, though, as I've said before, consider all of this information as a jumping off point. I feel like if you feel, you want to learn more about any of these topics, check out these 2 books by Bushman and Brody, read Wikipedia articles, look at firsthand sources and accounts. If you want to learn more about the life of this wild prophet man, Joseph Smith, because I feel that the more learning and the more education you can get in your hands is definitely going to mean that you can make a more informed decision for your life. And ultimately, like I've said many times, how you interpret these events of the life and times of Joseph Smith will completely ultimately end up with, if you believe that he was a prophet, or if you believe he was just a man who was looking for power and went from being a poor man living in obscurity to being a prophet with thousands of followers, acres and acres and acres of land, and many, many wives. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, drop a comment if something stood out to you, and as always, I will see you all next week.